Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now remember when my mum bought a pre-built Dell PC and well, it turned out she made a pretty good purchase, albeit without any real PC knowledge? Well, today I want to take a look at this. This is a computer built by my friend Michael. Now Michael is new to the world of PC building. In fact, he's new to the world of PCs altogether, or was, having come from the land of the console, namely a PlayStation 4 that sounds like London City Airport during rush hour. Since then, the traitor, my good friend, has decided to get an Xbox One X instead. So I said I'd format and sell his recently assembled PC for him, but not before critiquing it of course, and seeing how it performs. So let's get into it. Now originally he asked me to build something for him with a strictly no RGB rule in place. Eventually he changed his mind and built a system himself, just so he could learn how to do it, and I think the patience has certainly paid off aesthetics wise. I see he also stuck to the no RGB rule. This is the no RGB please PC review. To get a full idea of the specs as well as the total cost, I asked for a few invoices, and safe to say at just under £400, this seems like a decent build for the money. To start with, we have an AeroCool 380X case. This apparently comes in at £30 if you want the clear side panel, though at CCL you can find it for just under £17 if you don't mind a standard black door. What I like about it is the separated space for the power supply at the bottom, not something you see too often with these cheaper cases. It makes the build seem a lot neater, especially if you're not that brilliant with cable management. Speaking of which, and the power supply was actually a pretty bad choice. Before I sell it, I've replaced the cheap 600 watt unit with my older but reliable Corsair 650 watt PSU. The original choice was, well, questionable, and if there's one thing you should never cheap out on, it's the power supply, especially when you're spending a few £100, dollars or euros on a system. There's a great list over on the Linus Tech Tips website detailing different quality units, all separated into tiers, and this has helped me make some pretty informed decisions in the past when building computers. The motherboard was an interesting choice too. See, I've made comments before regarding AM4 motherboards saying that you should opt for B350 or B450 boards for Ryzen because they have overclocking potential. But here's the thing. If you're certain you never want to overclock your Ryzen processor and are happy with a no-frills board that might save you some extra cash, then go for it if it has all the features you're looking for. If it's the matter of a tenner difference, then a B350 or B450 board would be a no-brainer in some respects, but I can see some money was definitely saved here, considering it was purchased for just £33 and opened over at Amazon Warehouse Deals. Atop this board is a Ryzen 5 1400. That's a name I haven't heard in a while. When it first released, the Ryzen 5 1400 sat at an awkward position on the market. Some people said leave it, save the money and get a Ryzen 3 instead, or spend a little more and get a Ryzen 5 1600. It's that awkward position on the market that works in this thing's favour today. See, it can be found for similar money to a Ryzen 3 on the used market while offering 8 threads and better overall performance. This open box one costs just £88 at Overclockers UK. I think if you can find one for that sort of money, then it's still worth it and should be more than capable when it comes to modern gaming. The GPU actually seems like the best deal here. £148 for a 6GB 1060 from Pallet in what looks to be unused condition. This was an eBay find, but it's not too uncommon to find 1060s at great prices these days, especially the 3GB version. Whether you should still buy one of those is a story for a whole nother video though. Pallet are actually among my favourite manufacturers, having owned their 750 Ti and 1050 and never having any issues. The 1060 is a card that isn't too power hungry, so it requires a 400 watt PSU and just one 6-pin connector. Still, I wouldn't have run it too long on the PSU that was originally inside this build. To finalise the specs, we've got 8GB of team memory, an excellent choice, and the RAM that I always go for too. £60 for brand new 3000MHz DDR4 is a pretty good price, considering the same 2400MHz variant cost pretty much the same. The 240GB PNY SSD is a nice final touch too, though will get filled up pretty quickly. I noticed that after reinstalling Windows as well as Nvidia drivers and any operating system updates, we had about 202 gigs left to play with. This of course could be filled after installing just a few of the latest AAA games. Still, installing the operating system on an SSD is the perfect way to ensure fast boot times, and you can always add a traditional 1TB HDD later on for extra storage. At £399 total, it seems like a decent mid-range setup, aside from the £24 El Cheapo power supply that's now been removed. Personally, I probably would have spent a little more on a B350 board as well, but this one's perfectly okay for running the Ryzen 5 at stock speeds. I guess now we must see how this combination of parts performs with a few popular and modern titles. To kick things off, I ran the Cinebench R15 multi and single core tests to see whereabouts the Ryzen 5 1400 sits in terms of performance. Interestingly, the multi-core score puts it between an i7 3770 and 4770K from Intel, so I'd say you're looking at close to stock 4770 performance here, if you wanted something to compare it to. The single core test score was 131, around about the same that most Ryzen processors seem to achieve. It's worth remembering that if you want to buy new, the difference in some countries between this and say a first gen 1600 price wise can be pretty slim, but this should still hold its own just fine. First up for the games we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey, a game that in my experience doesn't like quad-core processors all that much, even ones with 8 threads. I found that the 6 cores of a Ryzen 5 1600 handle this a lot better, but the game has never run very well to be honest, CPU wise. The in-game benchmark test at high settings returned 52 frames per second on average, and from the MSI Afterburner stats in the top left corner, you can see that these components are pretty well matched. Medium would likely guarantee a closer to 60 FPS experience, but honestly Odyssey is all over the place when it comes to performance. I've seen cards that should be weaker than a 1060 hit higher frame rates, and cards that should be more powerful perform worse. Battlefield 5 performed very well with an average of 74 frames per second and a mix of high and ultra settings, with 1080p resolution of course. The ultra preset itself made us see a few more dips below 60, but a mixture of the two highest settings seemed to provide the sweet spot for this great looking modern release. I played through the first few scenarios, then this mission set in France, as well as an hour or two of multiplayer, combining the average over my playtime. As we began this single player level, there was a few instances of stutter, but this just disappeared after a few seconds. Perhaps the game was just loading a few final assets or something. I really don't know. Now it's a slightly older one, but at some point or another it's likely you'll want to play something that hasn't been released in the last few years, so I decided to see how BioShock Infinite would perform today on this mid-range build. As you'd expect, we had no problems here with an average of 150 FPS at Ultra, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 121 and 95 respectively, a smooth experience throughout. If you build a PC like this to tackle your older games collection, well, you'd have no trouble whatsoever. Far Cry 5 at 1080p saw a return of just over 60 FPS on average, using a mixture once again of high and very high settings. I was trying to get the best graphical quality out of the games here while retaining solid frame rates. The 1% low of 51 and 0.1% low of 43 reflects the fact that there was no significant stuttering to be seen here, not only during the in-game benchmark test, but over the course of a couple of hours gameplay as well. It's a great game, but the map doesn't vary too much, so performance should be similar no matter where you are in this vast open world. Fortnite at epic settings ran at 86 frames per second, very smoothly might I add. Although there wasn't much going on during my recorded gameplay here, I can safely say there'll be no trouble achieving at least 60 FPS with any setting. There will be a few dips in busier areas and of course when the action heats up, but all in all it's a very pleasant experience with this hardware. Michael mate, your 600 watt off-brand power supply probably would have blown up by now. Just Cause 4 puts a lot more strain on the graphics card. As you can see, usage for that is hovering around the mid-90s, whereby the Ryzen 5 1400 has a lot more to give. Regardless, a brief hour of messing around in the snow at very high settings with SMAA off returned a healthy 66 frames per second on average. Again, no real stutter here, but the map is huge, so performance will fluctuate. But you should still see at least 60 frames per second most of the time. If there are any issues with a build like this, then high instead of very high would be the way to go. Overwatch at the ultra settings preset proved to be no problem either. The footage here was from a bot match, but the figures were taken from online. This is just an easier way for me to capture more fluent gameplay. There will be no problems here at all for the Ryzen 5 1400 and 6GB 1060. Performance numbers will be a little different from map to map though, as expected. Finally, I ran the Shadow of the Tomb Raider in-game benchmark, which with the high preset gave us an average of spot on 60, with a 52 FPS 1% low and 0.1% low of 46. Again, a pretty respectable result for our final game test here. All in all, this build seems fairly capable, especially considering the total price paid, thanks to a little help from the open box market. You don't have to shop around from third-party sellers to get great deals, as retailers will sometimes have sales that can knock quite a decent amount off of certain hardware. My only concerns with this originally was the cheap power supply, which might have been fine, who knows, and the A320 board, but as I said, don't feel like you have to get a B3 or B450 board just because the internet tells you to. If you're happy with the features of an A320 offering and have no intention to overclock whatsoever, and are on a tighter budget with no real room for manoeuvre, then go for it. The Ryzen 5 1400 still handles itself pretty well too, and sometimes can be found closer to the price of a Ryzen 3, which makes it more tempting in some scenarios even today. Plus its unpopularity means it's more likely to see further reductions in the future. But there we have it. This has been the No RGB Please Build review. I think for a first time build, my friend here has done a pretty decent job. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoyed making it. If you did, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't enjoy it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know what you think of this PC build. And hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.